Hello and welcome in today's webinar. My name is Jakob, and we are broadcasting live from CareerFoundry's headquarters in Berlin. I'll be moderating today. I'm joined by Olga, one of our user interface design mentors, and she will be talking about typography and how to pick the right fonts for your UI design projects. For those new to CareerFoundry, we create career change programs in technical topics like UX design, UI design, web development, and data analytics. This webinar will take approximately 30 to 40 minutes. If you have any questions, just drop them in the chat and we'll answer them right after the webinar. For now, I'll let Olga take it away.
Thank you, Jakob. It's a real pleasure being here in this fantastic office with these super inspiring people around and be able to talk about typography worldwide. So what we'll cover today is why typography is important, and we delve into typography basics and terminology. Then the most important topic, which is how do you really choose a font for your layout, and we'll finish with common mistakes to avoid. So before we start, let me tell you a little bit about me. I've been mentoring at CareerFoundry for almost nearly 4 years, and it's really inspiring to see so many people switching their careers and getting to know more about design worldwide. I'm also working as a product designer, and I've been in Berlin for the last 6 years doing UI, UX, even user research whenever it's necessary for digital products, working in several companies. So these are mostly known in Europe, and started with e-commerce. And at this point, I'm actually with a leading company builder for AI-powered manufacturing efficiency called Corporate Digital. So building products like this one that you see on the mobile screen to improve efficiency and in the factories. Then let's go straight to the topic. So why is actually typography important? And you will see like, hey, Olga, this quote is pretty old. And we no longer have only text in the web. So even though that's true, nowadays you still have quite a lot of written text in your applications. Even Snapchat, there was somebody who did actually an analysis of how many pixels include text in different applications, and even Snapchat got 3%. Of course, it sounds ridiculous, but the fact is, even something that is fully visually driven, it still has some impact in the information that you have there. So why then, going into the details, basically if you choose the right font, it will reflect personality and will look professional. It will also help your brand to be consistent and communicate always in the same way. And ultimately what you want is actually users to recognize and remember your product better. So what we want to actually set the right tone and make sure that it creates a context for the communication to happen. Then in terms of basic terminology, and we see typeface fonts being used interchangeably, and sometimes people are quite confused. What does exactly that mean? So typeface will be the overall appearance and how actually a font looks, or how the general family of group of fonts, what are the common characteristics. The font will actually be a specific font file that you will use when you will be designing. And that could be either regular, bold, or italic, or it can be a sans or a serif of that font. And in case you're wondering what sans serif are, these are main classifications. So you have serifs, which has these little strokes at the end of each character that come up from when by the time we were still doing handwritten manuscripts, that they will be done accidentally with the manual writing, and then they were literally copied into metal forms so that they would be more recognizable. These little strokes actually help connect the letters and help the readability to so very long text usually, or books, are set in serifs. While sans serif is a font that start getting more and more prominent with the computer age. because in the early days of computing and screens, there was not so much high resolution, but that meant that you will not be able to see those serifs anyway, and it will actually look quite broken. So for that reason, sans serif becomes more and more prominent. And nowadays we see several other classifications, which can be a display font or be something that looks like handwritten script style, or can also be monospaced, which comes from the typewriters. And the slabs, ultimately slab serifs, are very thick serifs that appeared by the time we were doing printing with wood rather than metal, because you couldn't, like, these little tiny serifs would just be broken after a few prints, and that created the need to make thicker serifs in the typefaces. So I will talk a little bit more into detail about some of these terms. Keep in mind that we will cover baseline and X height in the next slides, and I will also mention ascendants and descendants when talking about the space in between the lines, as you see, called leading. So bear with me and feel free to kind of make a screenshot and refer to this slide whenever you need, if there's something that you don't understand. So in terms of terminology, we do have leading, which is the space in between the line, and line height is the more technical term that you use in software. So for when you talk with a developer or your mobile app, when you're designing for mobile apps or web, you actually usually tend to speak more about line height. And leading is the term from typography. So when you set up a line height that is too short or too tight, it's actually much harder to read. As you see, it's like very simple which one of these two examples is actually more comfortable to read. And it's good to give a little bit of spacing. In this case, I'm using 120, nearly 130% in the space between the lines. So that gives you a connection in between the words rather than across the lines. The other space we can consider is the space between letters, which is called tracking. Because you track several group of letters at the same time. It can be negative or positive. Ideally, you want to actually keep it neutral, particularly when working with text paragraph. That's mostly because the typographers set up and designed those fonts already with an ideal space in mind that will work perfectly. And the real time where you would actually have to change them is either when you use larger font sizes for headlines, for example, then you might want to reduce a little bit the letter spacing so that the words, the letters fit a little bit closer together because they're already prominent in the screen. And the other way around would be when you actually need to emphasize one word and you want to actually split those letters a little bit more. But ideally, you should not abuse it in the sense that otherwise it becomes illegible. Another good use case is to use it in capital letters. As you see, I actually applied some spacing in between those letters because capitals were designed to be used with lowercase. And then adding this little space in between will actually aid to have a little bit more negative space around the shape and make sure that it's more legible. It doesn't clash with the next one. Similarly, you also want to use small caps, which usually is a hidden feature in UI tools. But what it does is literally giving you the need to, and also the small caps is a property in CSS, so it can also be used in web. And what it does is fit neatly in the text paragraph and doesn't stand out. So what you will have is a paragraph that doesn't, there's a word that is capitalized like an acronym, and it won't really shout and scream at the user right away as soon as they look at that paragraph. The next term it will be, or the next advice will be actually how to really choose your fonts. So ultimately, you want to aim for readability, which is how actually the text is easy and enjoyable to read. And so we talk about legibility and readability. Legibility is just how easy it is to read, but readability is way beyond that. And it affects also the typography that you've selected. Ideally, you want to use neutral typefaces so that they're actually free of connotations. And surprisingly, there's even a font that is called neutral. So you can actually check it out. And you will see that there is a big difference between fonts that have so much character and they're they have so much expression and they have a very, it's like an extroverted connotation that you end up being distracted by them. So ideally, specifically when we talk about text that is meant to be readable, we're not talking about headlines or maybe logos. Perhaps those could be more stylized, could be more, have more character. But when we're talking about readable fonts, they actually are quite neutral. Then we also want to look at the contrast. So you see here some examples, and that's the difference between the thinner area and the thicker area. So there are some cases when the contrast is so big that it will actually become really hard to read over long term. And in the opposite case, when there is absolutely no contrast, you might just end up having quite a boring experience if you have a long text with that font there. So there is always a good balance. And speaking about balance, the best example is for eye size and angle of aperture, mostly because they're kind of the opposite. Either you have one or you have the other. And most of the times they kind of exclude themselves. So eye size is the space on the top of the E, which is like the enclosed space in letters like E or A. And the angle of aperture is the area that is open. So it also exists in C's and the top of the A's, for example. And usually, as you see in this example, they're kind of the opposite. So ideally, you want a good balance where there's a good eye size, but there's also good angle of aperture, so that these letters are not confused, not mixed up with other letters. So in, like, for example, an C can be mixed up with an O if the angle of aperture is too tight. Then a practical checklist for our. So you're basically now thinking, okay, Olga, this is super theoretical, and I'm actually want to make sure that this font actually it has some style, because I'm really not sure which one I should choose for my headlines. So let's go a little bit into more detail. What other options you need to look into for that reason. So you want to create a really nice mood for your product, and you might want to think, what kind of product are you actually building? Is it something that is really serious and professional, or it's actually an app for learning for kids? Or maybe it's actually something that is for lifestyle and more specific to business people. So think of that mood in the first place, and think how that reflects and how that is connected to the typeface. So the more rounded version will be cuter and softer and more friendly, while something that has a really big contrast might be actually more classy. Then we also want to look into hex height. Specifically, if we want to use that font in smaller sizes, we actually want to consider how legible it is. And ideally, you want to make sure that your X height is big enough. So notice that in this example, you have all fonts with all the same size. That's why the letter T is there, to make sure that it doesn't look like I'm cheating here. And the fact is that some of them have a much higher X height than others, which will make sure that all the other letters will also be more legible because they are clearer. This will mean that the ascendants and descendants are shorter. So the top of the Ds and bottom of the Ps, which also might mean that then you might actually have a very tight area. So this could be ideal for smaller font sizes, but it could also be a good compromise and make sure that it doesn't get too tiring if you have really long text using this font. Okay, sorry. I think I skipped. Yeah, I kind of feel like I'm skipping some of the slides here. So in terms of width and height, We want to actually also analyze what are our needs. Maybe there are cases where you want a font to be used in a very narrow space, so you actually need a condensed version, also called narrow. Or maybe there are cases where you want something more elegant and more airy, and you want to actually have a thin version of that font, of that typeface. So consider fonts that actually have different widths as well, and look at the characters list. So maybe you will need actually accented characters. So if you're working with any language that is not English, there are really high chances that you need to look if there are special characters for those languages. The same happens if you're working with numerics and numbers like tables, where you want those numbers to be aligned and you want to make sure that they don't look misaligned. As you see in this example, they're actually all straight, even though there's a 1, because the 1 has more space. And even though it looks further away from the 2 when put next to it, it actually lines perfectly over a table. And old style numerals are the ones that you actually that you want to use within text paragraphs, so that they, equally as using small caps, they will not stand out right away, and they will be really neatly integrated because they will fit in that paragraph text. Also, there are some times, and this is quite a hard one, because there's a lot of fonts like the bottom one where the J's and Q's stand out. And if you end up using capital headlines, so if you will use caps in your headlines, you might want to make sure that your J's and Q's don't stand out of that rectangle paragraph line. And also you need to make sure that those letters actually can be distinguishable, particularly when it's really important. So there are some fonts where the I's and L's and 1's are all messed up and they all look alike. And it will depend on the type of product that you're building, how important that could be, actually, that all the letters are really clearly recognizable as well. Maybe you're working with something for dyslexic people, which will be really important for that reason. Last topic of today's webinar will be actually some mistakes that I've seen here and there. A lot of them actually been done by my students as well, which is pretty normal, because when we're learning, we make some mistakes and we end up using too many fonts, which kind of looks really messy and a little bit, it's understandable because it looks like an exploration, but then in the reality, in the real product, it doesn't look very professional. Even when you're using the same fonts of the same, or even using different fonts from the same typeface, if there are too many of them, what will also happen is that you're actually downloading a lot of files and making the user download those files over an internet browser, which is also not so nice when you could just customize those. Ideally, the same actually happens when you're using these different styles, these different fonts of the same typeface. You want to think of the width in between. So ideally, you don't want to use the font that is the style that is right next to each other. So I would not recommend to use a bold and a medium, which are very similar, mostly because you want to make sure that there's a clear difference between them. The same for the font size. And this is exactly what's basically mentioned here. So if you have, or already shown here, if you have very similar widths, they don't really stand out. You kind of look alike. There's not so much emphasis on any of them. And it actually looks quite opposite, which is a little bit buggy. The same with sizes. So ideally, you want to look into a type scale. And there's a really nice tool online where you just put your baseline. You select the scale that you want. Don't select the first option because they're really close to each other, but all the other ones, maybe the last one will also be too far away, and it's very unlikely that you want such a big difference between the styles, but something in the middle usually works pretty well. And you then see that it's actually not linear. So the numbers on the bottom are a little bit closer together, but the numbers on the top are much larger and in distance between them. So it's kind of a little bit like a Fibonacci sequence. So this makes sure that there is a very big difference between the styles. Then the other mistake that I often see is that tracking and how tight that the letters are between themselves. The same for the letter spacing. The same happens when the letters are too far away or the paragraphs are too far away, because suddenly it's no longer so comfortable to read. Of course, I'm exaggerating this, but the fact is it does get in the way between the user and the message that you're trying to convey. So suddenly the paragraph looks more like bullet points rather than actually a block of text. Similarly, when you use justification, it does actually add spacing between the words. And what it happens, it starts creating what we call horse teeth in typography, also known as a rivers, as you see the spacing like starts creating a nice neat river in between the lines that floats that floats among your paragraph. So ideally, you don't actually want to use justification. Of course, there are ways to control it and really be super precise nowadays, but most of the time, there's really no time for it over a project, and you can just float everything to the left, right? So like in English languages, Western languages mostly, you have left aligned text, which will then float neatly and will never have this issue happening. Then lastly, we have sometimes text just set in capitals full on. And of course, that can be used in shorter words or headlines, but perhaps using it over a full block of text will actually be quite distracting and also not so readable. Mostly because we do read the ascendant and descendant, and these areas are helping us to understand the word, because we don't read each single individual letter, while in capitals it's actually much harder to do that. So there is this really great study from the 60s where they will just analyze road signs written in capitals or written in sentence case, and for information retrieval it's definitely much more useful to have the first letter capitalized and everything else lowercase. So yeah, this is a little bit of a preview, and don't do things like this, which kind of is a designer's nightmare, and make sure that you actually look into CareerFoundry's design course if you want to learn more, and put all of this knowledge into practice in real case examples that you will end up with a portfolio by the end of the course. And check out also the next webinar that is about how to become a UI UX designer with CareerFoundry.
Great, fantastic. Olga, we have some really interesting questions. So I'm gonna start with the most popular one. How many fonts can be used in a project? So if you're designing an app, how many fonts would you use for?
So yeah, that's a fantastic question. Great, really straight to the point. Ideally, we usually say 1 is enough, 2 is too many. And you can actually select 2 typefaces and play with those a little bit in order to have also, you might need a bold or italic for emphasis. Ideally, I would say do not make the user download more than 3 or 4 font styles. Mostly you want to have 2 different, ideally you want to select a serif and a non-serif. You can also have a display and sans. And then just have those, use those, and maybe in some cases have on italic for emphasis.
So this question is kind of related to the previous question. What is the minimum and maximum font size to use for both web and mobile design?
Mm-hmm. So you want to set up, as we saw in the type scale, you want to set up the baseline. And the baseline will give you a direction, which will mean that you want to have a set of scale. So the minimal, as you've seen, there are some fonts that have a very different X height, which will mean that we'll need to be used in larger format, and others that can have a much bigger X height, which perhaps don't need that such a big format. So it will always be how easy it is to read. Ideally, as designers, we actually put the screens in our phones, so we kind of have a way to transfer the designs into our phones as an image or as a preview, and then test it. So that will be the real answer. In practice, if you want a real number, 12 will be really small font size. Ideally, you want to make paragraphs in 15 if it's a readable content. For some fonts, even 10 or 11 could be possible, but that's really seldom. Mm-hmm. For the big size, it will really depend. If it's a condensed font and things fit in the screen, go with as big as you can. Of course, you need to consider translations, which is a very whole different topic that we could make a big session about it. But reality is there is no setup number because it will always depend how much the text fits into the screen.
Great. Do you have any favorite fonts that you use for most of your projects? Is there like a startup font that you use?
Yeah, basically just go to Google Fonts, and I've seen that somebody's asking where you can find the fonts. Go to Google fonts.google.com, and then you can get the most popular ones. So I would say Open Sans, Lato. For me, this Essence serifs, those are pretty cool.
Nice. Do you have any other recommendations for sites where you can find inspiration about fonts?
For regarding sizes specifically?
No, regarding styles and finding inspiration, maybe finding new.
I do recommend subscribing to some newsletters. Fonts. Oh, now I'm trying to remember the names. So there are plenty of foundries. If you just search for foundries, maybe there are like their whole intention is to sell you fonts. So they send you a lot of inspiration on a weekly, even daily basis if you want to. So in that case, that could be a source of inspiration. Or in general, just look into typography blogs, or perhaps also Ellen Lupton has a really nice website called Thinking with Type. It's also a book, but you can also find a lot of information on the web. And there is a website called webtypography.net, which is based on the elements of typographic style, which was written a long time ago, but how that applies to the web.
Okay. What and where to use italic fonts?
Oh, wow, that's really good. That's a fantastic one. For emphasis, so don't abuse it. If you have user quotes, you can use those in the quotes, but usually you just have that over one word or a few words over a text. Well, the difference between italic and bold is bold jumps straight away at you. So you kind of look into a paragraph, you immediately see the bold, while italic doesn't stand out as much. So ideally you want to use in that case where you don't want people to look at that word right away, but you want to emphasize it so it looks different as you read.
Cool, thank you, Olga.
Pleasure.
I guess this is a good one. How should we proceed in choosing the typography for a project if we have no requirements for that? Considering internationalization, difficult word, should we avoid trading font faces?
Depends again on the needs of really the product. So there will always be some requirements, at least the type of product that you're building. And you've seen that over this webinar. We covered some cases more like number focused or lengthy text. So what type of product are you building exactly? So in that case, you want to look into fonts that are more towards that direction. So there are already some limitations. And after that, it will really be how readable, how that reflects to the personality of the brand. And then it's just a matter of trying it out and seeing if that actually fits. A lot of times I do end up with several shortlisted candidates and then test them over the design. And if you create a style guide in your file, you organize your files correctly, you can easily switch the fonts and make sure that it changes everywhere, and then you can test it pretty quickly in your designs.
Actually, a nice suggestion comes from Pauline. She says definitely check out what font Chrome extension. It will let you inspect fonts on different sites. So if you're browsing a website and you see something very interesting, you can click on that extension. It will show you what font is being used.
Thank you, Paulina. That's a great suggestion.
Which font is a no-no for client presentation?
Comic Sans. That's an easy one. Also, there are fonts like Lobster, which are super popular, suddenly became, you can see them in all restaurants, but that looks quite unprofessional. Comic Sans will be seen as very childish and very informal, which you don't really want to give that impression. You want to appear professional and serious, so that I'm not sure if that's the type of answer that you were expecting.
Is there any occasion where you can use Comic Sans?
I would say that it is a font that the A's can be easily mistaken with O's, because the best case is to use an A that has the loop on the bottom rather than the A as if it would be handwritten one. So Comic Sans does that. So I would probably just refrain from using it. But I did use it in a school project, and I was terrified to see that years later myself.
There's a question from Leonora. Dan. Dan is asking, can you elaborate more on testing the fonts with users and colleagues? I guess when I design a screen for one of CareerFoundry projects, it's a bit difficult to just focus on fonts and typography. People will just say, in user testing, people will just say, I can't really read this, or this screen is badly designed. But how do you specifically maybe get the information about the fonts?
So you want to make sure that people get the right impression. You can just, you do your user research asking, how do you feel about this text? What does it make you think? Another way is to making sure that people actually read it, look at your screen in a good distance. So often I start looking into something very close. That probably means that it's actually too small. And maybe people will actually tell you. So like, well, I can't ask them to give you some specific information. That's a way of testing it as well. Try to make sure that they have to look into a text to find this information. And then that will allow you, that will give you the possibility to check if people could find that easily and how easily they could find, or you can even time it. So like give them two options, two different fonts that you're not sure which one to use, and say like, how did you find, can you find this information here and another information there? So people obviously don't look for the same thing, otherwise the second is easier. But make sure that you have a way of testing it in a way that is not so direct.
We are coming back to Comic Sans for a second.
Popular topic.
Controversial as well. Apparently, Comic Sans is the best font for dyslexic readability. So are there other fonts that are good for dyslexia or to make the apps more accessible?
Yeah, that's a very big topic. And I've even recently read a research on fonts that are ideal for dyslexics. And they would mention that it will be sans serifs, it will be also Roman, if I'm not mistaken, but then Roman fonts are unclear because Romans are also serifs. So it wasn't really clear for me there. And it is true that Comic Sans is proven to be good for dyslexia because the letters are slightly different and they're not really just torn apart. It's much more identifiable for dyslexic people. But then there are other fonts for dyslexics as well, which are much better and nicely designed and made on purpose for that. So I would probably recommend to use those rather than Comic Sans. I don't really have the name, so don't ask that at this point. Maybe like dyslexic fonts on Google probably return a good search.
Great. What about books? Do you have any book recommendations on typography?
So yeah, I mentioned Ellen Lupton. That was my, basically those are the two, my where I learned most for like Ellen Lupton's Thinking with Type and the Elements of Typographic Style. Those are really old school Bibles, but those principles do still apply. And nowadays, the cool thing is before the web would be, or any screen would be so low resolution that you will not be able to use a lot of fonts. But nowadays with web fonts, it's so much better. And with the high resolution screens, you actually end up having a much better definition that you would have on paper. So in reality is those old school principles still apply nowadays with web and digital apps.
Nice. Okay. Talking about old school, I feel like script fonts are a bit old school. So there's a question about script fonts. In which situation are script fonts mostly used, and in which situation is it good to mix two very different fonts together, like script font with sans serif, for example?
Wedding invitation. Those are classics. Something that does reflect handwriting as well. Sometimes maybe even a kitchen app would be, a recipe app would be a good example for that. Of course, it wouldn't be this classic script, but script also includes handwritten. So maybe somebody just wrote with a chalk over a whiteboard. That will also be a script actually considered into the script fonts, at least in fonts.google. That's where at least what's what I remember. I hope I'm not wrong.
Talking about serifs and sans serifs, are there any rules concerning these two types? For example, what's more readable? If the text is a bit longer, do you recommend using a serif or sans serif?
So it really depends on what type of product you're building. Again, there's no clear right or wrong answers. You might want to use a serif over the headlines to make a really classic look, but then have a very serious business sense on your body text, on your paragraphs. While the other way could also be true, because you might want something, a platform like Medium, where you have really great articles and can get really lengthy. They use a serif for that reason, because the serifs do connect the letters, and that allows for faster readability as well.
Great.
Faster reading, sorry.
There's a question that probably I'll be able to answer. Which font again did you use for the presentation? So I think we are using our company fonts. So check out Dean Pro and Trade Gothic.
So the Dean Pro is the condensed version, and the Trade Gothic is light.
Do you have any examples of apps, your favorite apps, where the use of typography is amazing, is really good?
Great. Oh, wow, that's a tough question. I need to go back to my phone and check what kind of apps do I have that. They're constantly switching. An app that I really like is, I mentioned it over the last workshop, Fashionable, or no, not Fashionable. It's a mindfulness app, but I forgot the name.
Is it?
Fabulous. I think it's Fabulous. But I can't really remember the type they're using. I know it's brilliantly designed. I just can't really pinpoint what style the font is. But ideally, the good font is actually something that you don't remember. If the font is really nicely selected, you will not remember it. That's the best design that you can possibly do, is getting out of the way, but still make sure that it's memorable. When people see it, they will recognize it as being your product.
Great. Maybe we can check the app after the webinar and include it. We'll send you a follow-up email tomorrow, so we can answer that question in that email. Question about justification of the text. Can justification be used for titles only, and the rest of the text with the regular spacing?
I'm not sure what you mean with regular spacing. So justification is either you align it on both ends, so it's both right and left, meaning that if it is used over the headlines, a lot of times the headlines are also only one line, so you will need to kind of have the text fitting like all those spaces, which will be pretty hard. Then you will actually need to really have a good content editor to make sure that it fits to the design, and that shouldn't be the case. You should start with the content and design with the content in mind, rather than design lorem ipsum as it was previously done, and then when you come up, when the real content comes in, sometimes it doesn't really properly fit correctly.
I guess this question is about, as a designer, you have to, I guess, design with a lot of content and restraints. What do you do if there's a lot of written content on the site?
Mm-hmm. So there's obviously no need to cut content because we want to look it nice. That's not the point. The point is how to make that content readable and more comfortable. So if there are 100 words, you don't fit all of those into one line, because that will make this line will be so long that you will actually, by the time that you finish it, you don't know which point is the next line. You want ideally to have around, like, I think it was 65 characters per line for a good line width, but yeah, that's a whole different topic. We're talking now about layouts, and the reality is you want to make sure that the font is readable. And if it's about the question, if it's more about the layout, how to try to break it up with images, maybe include a quote on the side so that the text floats around that quote. So there are several ways to kind of split a very lengthy content into a more readable format. Mm-hmm. And don't be afraid of scrolling. People scroll.
How do you know when a serif and a non-serif fonts are a good combo? So you mentioned in your presentation that you recommend mixing these two, mm-hmm. But how do you judge if it's a good combination? I guess. Yeah.
So ideally, you don't want to have the two fonts fighting for attention. So when we looked at the bad examples, they're like all those fonts are screaming for attention. You want one font to stand out and being the main character, and the other font will be actually the supporting role. So it should not, both should not have so much style. Only one of them could have more very differentiated characters. And those are the fonts that ideally you want to use for the headlines, because they will be more prominent, they will be larger, so they actually they're recognized much easier.
There's actually just a clarification on there's a clarification on the justification question. Right. Should I then not use justify option with my text ever? My teacher advises to use it all the time, but that creates gaps. Mm-hmm. So I guess when you have some text, yeah. With
if you're designing for something that is static, like a presentation, of course you can control that. If you're designing for a web application or a mobile application where the screen will never be the size that you want it to be, it will always change, and you can no longer control it, I would recommend not to do it unless you have a really good developer and plenty of time to control that to perfection. In that case, definitely yes, and you will win a design award for it because it's so nicely done. But most of the time in the real life projects, that you don't really have the time for it. And then the chances of it being broken is just like much higher.
That's a question about navigation and buttons. How do you choose your navigation and buttons typeface? Is it okay to use the same as the body or rather not?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's perfectly fine. And it's the same with icons. You can have different icons for main navigation and other icons for other options, or you can have them exactly the same. So there's no black and white and like, does it look appropriate? And then the answer is it's great.
Let me go through the last few questions. What was the name of the book that you mentioned again?
So I mentioned the Thinking with Type.
Thinking with Type.
And the Elements of Typographic Style.
I'm just gonna...
I can actually... Do I have access to the chat?
Yeah. If you just... It's a question by...
I can put in the Q&A.
Yeah, and I'll publish it.
All
Perfect.
Right.
Let's do that. That's a good question. Is there a tracking limit? Don't exceed tracking over 15%, etc.
Yeah.
And is it okay to use a wider tracking on titles and neutral on the rest of the text?
So ideally, you don't, you want to have a neutral tracking on the text, particularly because you have mostly a lowercase sentence case. While in the titles, it depends. If you're using headlines, yes, but if you're using, again, sentence case, then don't do it, because you're actually altering the space between the words that which the typographer said this is the ideal spacing. So unless you're really using in super high format where you can condense them a little bit, make them closer so they become more readable, so they're not so wide. Otherwise, don't change it. And 15% will probably be already too much, unless you're kind of really want to emphasize something or make something very prominent. So a good example that I remember is the Alien movie poster, where the alien is so spread out that it's actually looks like you're into space, and that's a really good case for like really large tracking.
Is it okay to use bold and italic for a button?
Yes, because then you might have that text more visible, particularly with bold. Perhaps italics, I wouldn't say so. And also italics are a little bit harder to read. So what will be the real justification, unless it's just for the style. And if you want something that looks a little bit more fluid, then in that case, yes. Just keep in mind that italics can also have fake italics, meaning that rather than using the real italic, which is a very different letter, like the way the letters are written out is different, you will just have the letters tilted, which is called the fake italics. So if you're using italics just to give it more dynamic feel, then rather pick a different font. That would be my advice.
Okay. What about scanning the text? So do you have any advice on how to make the text scannable when the user scans the page for faster reading?
Then use bold. This is what I do on my blog for the content that I want to actually emphasize. I just put it in blog. It's also a blog in bold. Sorry. It's also good for SEO, for Google to find you and be able to prominently display your content as good. In that sense.
Great.
And also use the quotes. While you're still looking for a question, I can continue. Maybe add a quote that is emphasized from that text.
Okay, this is quite interesting. When having a banner or a logo above grouping of text, would you recommend the banner or the logo text to be smaller to the body, or doesn't matter as long as readability is the key?
So we're talking about logo design, which could have a very different typeface. A lot of times the logo doesn't really reflect the body or headline typography. It's a completely different style. Good example is Airbnb in the past, when they still had, they don't really use the lettering that they have for the logo, as far as I remember, in their titles. So that could be completely different. On the other hand, if it's a readable typeface, then why not? I might as well use it and make sure that it's also recognizable.
Another question from Frank. Do you have any method?
That's one of my students, sorry. Hey, Frank.
Do you have any method in using Google Fonts or searching for fonts? How do you search for fonts?
So I do actually look into the fonts online, or I search for something very specific, so rounded or slab or sans serif, or I just put several options in my file and then pick from those. And regarding searching, I think Google Fonts is really powerful because it has a lot of web fonts. So it doesn't really include fonts that are not safe for digital. And that's why I keep referring back to it over and over.
Okay. There are a couple of questions about trends. Do you follow trends?
Probably I should do more, but yeah, if there's anything specific that they mentioned, I would love to comment on that.
A couple of people want to know if what are the trendy fonts right now?
Oh, I think there is no such a thing of there is this font that is being used over and over. It's not like in icons where you have the isometric designs or something like this, or the color, like the color of the year from Pantone. I don't think there's such a thing for typography because it gets a little bit out of the way. Reality is there are always new players, and mostly those get picked up quite soon, and then people get tired of those. Mm-hmm. So I think that's what ends up happening. So check actually the newest releases rather than the most popular, because the most popular is because they've been used for long enough, while the trendy ones are the ones that you actually want to look into, the new releases.
Mm-hmm. There are a couple of questions about different languages. So let's say you're designing a product that is published in Russian, Arabic, English, and Finnish. Do you know how to adapt to different writings like Arabic or Russian, for example? There are different alphabets. What is the best way to handle design in this case?
So reality is you have a lot of fonts that actually include non-Western languages. So I would perhaps select one of those. Apart from that is literally look at the characters and see if they fit, like follow the recommendations from what we've seen over before. And make sure that if the font that you selected for Western languages has those, but then doesn't include non-Western languages or Cyrillic, for example, in this example, or Arabic, then look for a font that kind of is similar, but fits and includes the characters from those languages as well. There's like the recommendations are pretty much the same. It needs to be readable, and the challenge there is actually depending on the product that you're building and the style that you want to convey.
What about native iOS apps? Do you recommend using Apple fonts for body text and headings?
The same with Google Material Design. So if you're designing for Android, go for Roboto. It's a very recognizable and easy font, unless you want to have a really specific style and you want to communicate that. So we go again back to Airbnb. And so in that case, the reason to use the system fonts is at first you don't make the user download a separate file, even though you might say like, well, it's just like when you download the app, who cares? It's only once, but it's still extra size in your application. And what will be the real reason to select something extra? It needs to be really specific to your product and very distinguished in a certain way. So if that's not the case, stick with the system fonts. Users already know them. They already got used to them because they use them in other apps. So that will be the benefit for the users as well.
Okay. We have a question about choosing a font for your own personal brand or logo. So maybe you could talk about, you mentioned you have a blog. Maybe you could talk to us about how you selected the font.
It didn't change it. I just select the style. I really trust the tools. It's the same with Medium. Why would you want to change the predefined font when they already pick the font themselves and they make sure that it's readable and appropriate? So yeah, maybe that's not the answer you were waiting for from a designer, but I do select the fonts for the products I'm designing, but not for the products that I'm using. In that case, I actually trust the designers in those teams to do that.
They already hire a lot of designers and they do a lot of user testing to pick those fonts. Okay. Should the baseline be the same if you have a big font next to a small font?
That's a really good question. So, wow, that's a whole topic which called mathematical typography, and you can check that out. And I thought it would be way too complex, so I didn't include it in this webinar. So what I do in my CV, for example, is I calculate the baseline between a smaller font and a larger font to make sure that it matches once in a while. So every 6 lines or every 8 lines, something like that. And then even though doesn't align every time. It does align in some places, and that looks much neater in that sense. So if you use the same baseline with a smaller font and a bigger font, it will mean that the smaller font, if it is a paragraph, it will actually have a leading that is too big. While if that's not the case, if it's just one single label, then that's perfectly fine.
Do you think that it's better to play with scale for visual hierarchy or with font weights? And there was another question actually about how to create a visual hierarchy. So maybe these two can be combined.
That's a very big topic. It's more like when we're not getting into layouts. Reality is you can use both and make sure that they're actually quite different. That's the point. You can sometimes I also do the opposite. I make a font bigger, but then play with the weight so that it fits, the style doesn't look like it changed. So for example, the smaller font will be thicker or more like with more weight, will be bolder than the larger font, which then will mean that they look the same width, but they're not, because this one is larger than the other, it's much thinner. So you can play with it and see how that works. There's really no clearly set rules. You can use size and you can use weight. Sometimes you also use size and weight if you really want to emphasize something, if you really want people to look into the headlines, for example.
Okay. Thanks so much, Olga. This is all what we have time for today. Join us if you're interested in becoming a UX and UI designer. Join us on March 25th for another webinar. And make sure you follow us on our social media channels. This type of webinar will become a series of different webinars. Olga will be working with us on producing more of these.
Pleasure being here.
Thanks,
and thank you everybody for joining.